A man walking his dogs through this industrial desert in Melbourne's north stumbled across a skull on Thursday evening. It had several bullet wounds in the side. After further investigations, police recovered the rest of the body, and although they're yet to establish an identity, they're confident they know who it is.
Whilst we don't have any positive information at this point in time, it is quite a possibility that it is in fact Karmein.
It was almost a year to the day since she'd been abducted. Forensics fairly quickly confirmed that, yes, indeed, it was the body of Karmein.
A devastated Phyllis Chan held a traditional Buddhist ceremony with her two daughters in the Thomastown wasteland where Karmein was found, offering food and flowers and praying for her soul.
Terrible sadness at a whole range of levels now that she's gone forever. And the knowledge that the individual involved in this case, perhaps all of the cases, was prepared to escalate his activities to that point.
The execution-style murder of Karmein Chan indeed was a massive escalation, but it also raised new questions for task force investigators. Was Karmein abducted and killed by Mr. Cruel, or could it have been someone else with a different motive?
What does 3 bullets in the head tell you about the offender or the nature of the offence?
I suspect this was a message being sent. This was a child, a daughter of a family member, and this was about the link between the father and the offender. Karmein Chan was simply just the vehicle used to make the point.
Graffiti sprayed on the Chan's family car on the night of Karmein's disappearance has raised speculation about a vendetta against the family, which owns 2 restaurants.
I knew Phyllis Chan before the abduction. I knew her afterwards. I live in Eltham and dined at her restaurant a number of times. I don't for one moment think she was involved in any way in drugs.
What about John Chan, her husband?
I don't know so much about John, and he took off fairly quickly after the killing of Karmein, so I really don't know enough about John.
Victoria Police established Task Force Spectrum as soon as Karmein Chan was abducted. It was a multifaceted investigation because of all the similarities to the earlier abductions. But I've been told by a couple of former Spectrum members that in their opinion, the underworld drug connection was not chased hard enough.
What you need to know is that there were several crews involved in that investigation, and each of the crews had different responsibilities. My crew had the responsibility of putting together the brief of evidence and interviewing the suspect if we located him. There were members sent throughout the world conducting investigations, and advice was sought from police forces throughout the world. Other crews had the responsibility for looking at the drug involvement, and to my knowledge, that avenue of inquiry was exhausted as far as we could have at the time.
But not excluded?
No, it's not been excluded to this day.
I swear I do nothing wrong, and I've been here 15 years, all way in business. I start 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock in the morning and finish at midnight. So I work hard, I know a good opportunity to Australia.
There was no evidence to connect John Chan with the disappearance of his daughter, so police turned their attention back to the prime suspect.
The reason the police kept coming back to Mr. Cruel was because he had a history of laying false trails. Remember the $25,000 ransom demand made with Nikki Linus? It came to nothing because she was released without any further demands being made. And that was not the only false trail laid by Mr. Cruel.
In one of the houses, he picked up the telephone and pretended to talk to somebody, and he did it in front of the victim, when in actual fact the police were able to show that he'd actually cut the line beforehand and he wasn't talking to anybody. The spray painting of the car was another tactic to try and divert them away to make them think that isn't connected to the others. This is obviously an attack because of something the father did.
The abduction of Karmein Chan prompted a massive response from the public. Anyone who had a suspicion about their neighbour or someone they knew was calling into Task Force Spectrum. Every single piece of information had to be followed up and scrutinised. Such was the pressure to find Mr. Cruel and stop him re-offending.
We received somewhere in the vicinity of 10, 11,000 individual information sheets that had to be physically investigated by a detective. We physically inspected over 30,000 houses trying to seek out the detention premises. We sent a letter to all the doctors in Victoria seeking any information in relation to any clients they may have. And that's the other issue that perhaps highlighted it into its infamy, was that there was potentially several victims, many more than what we knew of at the time.
How many do you put together as being part of this investigation?
Broadly speaking, perhaps a dozen. And therein lies the challenge from a community perspective. If it's promoted as the bogeyman, then the response is going to be lock up the doors, keep the children inside and trust no one.
The police were working around the clock, chasing up any and every lead that might have led to Mr. Cruel. If he was responsible for the abduction of Karmein Chan, the question the police had to answer was why did he not release her as he had Nicola Linus and Sharon Wills? Why did he feel the need to murder her?
We have no idea. There are plenty of theories, but there is no evidence that points us in any one direction.
Next, we reveal the prime suspect.
Just a few questions about the Mr. Cruel investigation.
No, I don't want to talk to you.
They found a balaclava and a knife in his attic. Mr. Cruel, of course, wore a balaclava and used a knife.
To this day, Victoria Police is still unclear why Karmein was killed by her abductor. One thing they know for sure is that Mr. Cruel went to incredible lengths to keep his identity a secret.
Phyllis Chan said that Karmein was a very feisty 13-year-old and she would not have gone quietly. And what the police and she suspect is Karmein maybe whipped his balaclava off or pulled hers off and saw his face. Once she'd seen Mr. Cruel's face, I think that he probably said, I can't release this one.
If the killer is unmasked, he may well indeed be forced into killing the victim.
Absolutely. I fully agree with that. And that's another reason why the Karmein Chan case has not been excluded from the others.
As I mentioned earlier, Mr. Cruel could be connected to up to 12 assaults. I've spoken at length to his first documented victim from 1985. Understandably, she doesn't want to talk on camera, but she did relay what he said to her during the assault. My liberty, my freedom, is more important than your life. This is very telling when viewed through the lens of the Karmein Chan murder.
In the mid-1980s, DNA testing was in its infancy, and poor forensic work in the early cases dramatically impacted later investigations.
Quite a lot of the original exhibits and witness statements from 1985, 86, 87 that David Sprague desperately wanted were never able to be found. In one case, the victim, and I think it was his first victim, had been tied up and the rope was retrieved and the rope had been popped into a plastic bag. Whilst he got very good at covering his tracks, common sense suggests you don't start off that good. If he was ever going to make mistakes, it would have been in those early days. That rope could have had his DNA on it, and the Spectrum Task Force were mortified when they couldn't find the rope.
The 1985 survivor, in her statement, believes the assailant ejaculated in her, and swabs were taken. Do you think if they are around, they could still be tested?
They could certainly be matched if they're still in existence.
Good evening, Crime Stoppers.
The Mr. Cruel case was one of the first where Victoria Police tried to build a profile of the offender.
What we're dealing with here is a very disturbed individual who's certainly creating an atmosphere of terror in this town.
Tim Watson-Munro, a criminal psychologist, was brought in on the case before Sharon Wills was abducted.
He just strikes me as your textbook psychopath. Somebody who plans a crime meticulously, no forensic evidence. So I think more likely he's an individual who had sexual perversions floating around in his head, and it just went from there, and it escalated quite dramatically once he crossed the Rubicon and started breaking into places and then abducting children. And I predicted, sadly correctly, that the next one may well be killed.
I can't understand why you were taken. My pain at your going can never compare with the agony which you endured.
When Karmein Chan was abducted, police sought the help of the American FBI, which pioneered the idea of criminal profiling in the 1970s. This was the 3-page fax they sent through 11 days after Karmein was taken. It tallied with the view of investigators that Mr. Cruel was actually more like Mr. Average. He was aged from his 20s to his 50s, between 165 and 183 centimetres tall. His build was thin to medium with a small pot belly. He had no accent and was quietly spoken. This could have been any one of thousands of people.
The minute you start calling him Mr. Cruel, members of the public think he's a shady character with a dark overcoat that wanders out of X-rated shops carrying a bundle full of porn. In actual fact, he's probably a clean-living bloke who lives with his mum and puts the next-door neighbour's rubbish out on a Sunday, and the people around him might think he's a nice, normal bloke. At the end of a 3-year investigation, Operation Spectrum ended up with what they called the Sierra Files. So there was 7 suspects that had the propensity to commit this sort of crime and had committed similar crimes in the past, not quite as extreme, of which one of those suspects, a former Melbourne University lecturer, is, in the eyes of David Sprague, who was head of the task force, the prime suspect.
That man is Brian Enkler, and Channel 9's A Current Affair tracked him down.
Just a few questions about the Mr. Cruel investigation.
Go away, I don't want to talk to you.
He was jailed for 10 years in the 1970s after pleading guilty to tying up and attacking 6 girls at knife point over a 2-year period. You destroyed their lives.
So you say.
After Karmein Chan, they raided his house because he has priors for sexual offences, went to jail for 10 years in the 70s for attacks on children. They found a balaclava and a knife in his attic. Mr. Cruel, of course, wore a balaclava and used a knife.
You do admit that you're the prime suspect, though?
Well, I know I am because they've told me.
He's the one that David Sprague is pretty sure did it, but there is no forensic evidence to speak of, no witnesses. He denies it. How are you going to prove it?
Despite Sprague's belief, there is no evidence that Enkler is Mr. Cruel. And many think he is not the prime suspect.
That was one of probably a good half a dozen that were of equal suspicion. There are a number of suspects that haven't been eliminated. Quite a few.
Next, is Mr. Cruel still out there?
This is an active investigation.
It's been 28 years since Mr. Cruel abducted his last victim, Karmein Chan. No one's ever been charged, but the investigation remains open to this day. It's frustrating for police, but what's always baffled them is that Mr. Cruel's reign of terror came to an abrupt end after Karmein. Why?